Hi everyone, it's always a pleasure to have you guys for every episode that we've been having recently for the Operations Research Lab with Dr. Bakama. Today we're going to start with episode 2, which is mostly talking about identifying a research problem in operation management. And I'm always excited to start this series, but this one in particular, I felt like it's always interesting to talk about how we start with research. That's why I believe this episode is very crucial. The reason is because I believe that any research start with a problem, and this is what I said in my first episode, where I was like, if you do not have a problem, you do not have a research. And this is actually why this episode matters because at the end of the day, research starts with a problem. As we start, you realize that as an operation manager, as a manager overall, we operate in different environments and you start facing different challenges, which then will be transformed into problems, which then will lead to a research before we find a solution. Now, one of the things that most of the students struggle when it comes to the research problem is because they tend to actually choose broad topics, whereby when you are doing a research, you cannot search everywhere anyhow. You need to be specific. You need to have a particular focus so that you know what you are looking for. Sometimes as well, students tend to describe the industry instead of describing the problem. Let's say you are having a problem in your company about customer being dissatisfied because of the um, high waiting times, for example, in the queues. It's a problem for your particular organization, but you generalize it to the industry, which cannot allow you to get the real solution to the problem. The problem is within your company, but you want to generalize it in the construction industry, for example, in South Africa, while it is only your particular company that is facing that issue. At a certain point, there's also a big part which is a confusion between the operational challenge with the research problem. And I think in the next slide that will come, we are going to differentiate what are operational challenges and what are research problems, because you need to make the nuance between the two so you are able to actually come up with a good research problem. And the big thing as well is to be able to identify research gap. What is a research gap? Why does it matter in research? These are some of the things we're going to look in this video. But keep in mind as well that a weak research problem will lead to a weak dissertation or thesis. As I said, if your problem is not really strong, it is not robust, you won't, by problem mean problem formulation, won't be able to write a dissertation that makes sense because, as we say, the research, the dissertation, the thesis, it is based on the problem. The problem is the core of your research. If your problem is wrong, the whole dissertation or thesis might be wrong. Now, we talk about the operational challenges versus the research problem. What is the difference between the two? When we're talking about the operational challenge, we mostly look at a practical issue that an organization can be facing. It can be things such as a high production delay, high stock out rate, poor service quality, high return products. Those are problems that are actually based on the challenge that an operation is actually facing or a business is facing. That's a challenge, and this challenge here can easily be addressed. For example, let's talk about high stock out rate, where we're running out of stock easily. The solution might just be to get more stock. That's an operational challenge, and we believe that if we do that, we can solve the problem. But the research problem on the other side, it is not about the operational challenge, but it involves the investigation, the examination part, and identifying what can be the problem and what is not even yet known in the literature. On the research problem part, you're trying to investigate why the problem happened. We try to examine, is there a relationship between this problem happening and maybe this other factor happening? So the difference is like the research problem needs to be measurable and researchable. For what aim? With the aim that the operational challenge is for the manager. And what the manager wants? The manager wants solution. We are running out of stock, give me stock. We have a poor service quality, let improve the quality. But on the other side, the researcher investigates the problem so that he might want to find a structured solution or evidence. And actually not just a solution, but a solution based on evidence. That's why you find many managers that can take a decision to say, we are always running out of stock, let's just order more. We order more, but still it happened now that most of the product we are having, we are still running out of stock, or maybe the product now just defective because now they are maybe, or they get spoiled because now we have overstock, and now we find in our situation where we solve the problem by bringing another problem. But the researcher on the other side is trying to investigate, why are we running out of stock? We have done this, we have done that, but it's not working. Is adding more stock going to be the solution? If not, why? So you're trying to identify the root cause so that you find a permanent solution. Because the operational challenge might give you a temporary solution, while the research problem will give you a permanent solution because it is assumed to be based on the evidences, on facts. Now, when you look at that, there's a key thing. We talked about one of the problems, which is mostly students struggling to have a real problem because a strong problem because they are sometimes lost between a topic, a problem, and a research problem. Look at the graph that is here or whatever you have on your slide here. It doesn't really make sense up until you contextualize what you do have. So a topic, when we are talking about research in general, a topic is a broad sector where we are talking about a certain field. Like in this case, inventory management can be a topic. As you can see, we are talking about when to restock, the reorder point, the number of items we have, the holding cost, the setup cost. These are everything that you will find under the inventory management part. But now, as an organization, the problem might be that we have high stock out. It means that most of the stock that we have, we kind of struggling to manage our stock. We kind of struggling to deal with our inventory. That is a problem. But now the research problem can be, for example, that we try to understand if there's a limited empirical evidence on how managing our focus can affect the stock out in Gauteng retail industry. Gauteng, by the way, is a province in South Africa where there's the city of Johannesburg. For those that are not living in Johannesburg, I mean South Africa. But now you can see that the green part is talking about the problem. And the problem needs to be specific. We are talking about finding evidence on how managing the demand can affect the stock out way in routing, way in small, medium enterprises. So this same problem can be taken maybe in large companies. This same problem can be investigated in another location. And that might give us another solution, which helps us to build our literature review. So you see that a topic is I'll put it like pink salmon pink. It's this whole thing, this whole problem is under inventory management, but the real problem is high stock out. But out of that, the research problem, what you are trying to find out, it is mostly to look at how focusing can maybe affect the stock out that you have in SMEs. Why SMEs? Because in this case, we might find ourselves in an organization where they do not necessarily well structured like this all big organization. They do not have necessarily a proper ERP and everything. So we find ourselves in a situation whereby you need to be specific. The key thing is a topic is broad, a problem is practical, a research problem is specific. So whenever you start, as you are working, keep in mind that we are building from the general up until going to the specific. So we are moving from the bigger part into the narrower part as we are moving. This is what research is all about. We try to understand what is general so we can narrow it down into something that is particular, which is the research problem in this case. So whenever you want to draw your research problem, start first of all by thinking about, try to look at things such as the topic first, then you identify the problem, then you narrow out to the research problem. Now, as we move on, what is a research problem per se? One thing, by definition, a research problem in operation management, first of all, we'll call it like a statement, but the objective of that statement is to be able to identify an operational inefficiency, is to be able to show a measurable impact, to highlight the knowledge gap, and to provide researchable data. Now, you if your problem is not really aligning with any of the four here, they are not actually limited to this, but generally a problem tries to do this to identify first of all the problem, and not any problem, to identify the inefficiency. Where are we going wrong? What are we not doing right? Why do we identify so that we should have a measurable impact? The measurable impact helps us to know whether we are doing good or bad. If I'm saying at this point that I want to understand the impact maybe of employee satisfaction and customer satisfaction in the call center industry, how do I know that what I'm doing is right or wrong? I can state, for example, that based on this, we can look at the number of customers complain as a measurable component here. We want to see, for example, that after 10 months, if we implement this, what is going to be the result versus 5 months? If that number is decreasing or increasing, we can see the impact that it is having, to say the more we satisfied our employees, are they also doing a good job with the customer? So it needs to be measurable. On the other side, you need to highlight a knowledge gap. You don't just do research for the sake of doing research. There is always a gap, and I think in the next slides to come, we're going to talk about a knowledge gap or a research gap. But the key thing is, like, whatever you want to bring needs to build into what is already existing, so that you are able to enrich and to lay foundation. Now, one thing that is true is like that a research cannot happen without data. Data is information that might not necessarily be processed. We try to understand what is happening with the customer satisfaction, but related to the employee satisfaction, I need to get my data. I can try to observe what happens in the workplace, how my employees are treated, how the customer are treated. That is data. I can try to get my data by just interviewing straight the employees. That is data. I can try to do that as well by just setting a questionnaire that I'm going to send to people that can fill it anonymously. That's data that I'm gathering. And we are living in a world where they say data is king. The more you have data, the more you can actually find a solution. You can actually improve whatever services you are providing. So if your research problem is not identifying the inefficiency, it doesn't show a measurable impact to say that after this problem, how do I know that I'm doing well or not? How, if you do not highlight any knowledge gap to fit in it what is missing, then you have a problem when it comes to your problem. You actually have a problem inside a problem, and you don't want that. Now, a research problem is trying to explain what is wrong, why it matters, and what it is not yet known. When we say what is wrong, we are addressing the inefficiency. Why does it matter? We are showing about its impact. And what it is not yet known, we're talking about the knowledge gap, obviously using data so that we can support our problem. Where do research problems come from? This is someone saying, how, in other words, the question is like, how do I find a research topic for my dissertation, for my thesis? Now, especially for masters and PhD students, my recommendation has always been one. Go with that route whenever you are when you are working, because it becomes much easier to identify what is happening in your workplace, what is happening with your customer in a value chain. You can easily identify problem when you are working compared to when you're not working. So sometimes it happens that I get some students that want to do the PhD or the master's journey just because they're bored. They don't have maybe a job. It's not necessarily advisable, because then you will try to start creating problems in your mind. But it's much easier to identify problems when you're already working, and that way you will be able to find research problem. Most of the time from industry inefficiency. You are working, you realize that in our industry, most of the time we are running out of stock in our industry. Most of the time we are struggling to deliver product faster or faster. And currently we are seeing a problem when, like in my industry, which is the higher education industry, we've noticed now that there are some technological disruption with AI. In fact, in many industries, AI is now disrupting the way we do things. What are we teaching that AI is not teaching? How can we compensate? Should we embrace AI? Should we be against AI? These are some of the questions that you have because of technological disruption. It brings a research problem there. The policy changes that one might have in the industry, the conflict of academic findings, where, for example, that in university so and so, this is what the findings have revealed, but in another country, this is what the findings have revealed. Then we have a gap there. Can be like, okay, let's try to experiment it in a neutral position and let's see what we will get. Obviously, we can get some other problem from supervisors and industry feedback. By supervisor, we're not talking about the research supervisor, but we're talking about your company supervisor. Then when you're working, your manager tells you that, but we have noticed this, and this. We have noticed a decrease in our production. But generally, when we get toward winter, our production decreases. What is the problem? What can we do? In that case, we also finding some research problems, and this is where they might come. But you find out that it might be much easier for you to find problems when you are actually in the workplace. Now, let's just take an example, the construction sector. South Africa on its own, or Africa on its own, is just a whole construction site. There are so many things that are happening, so many buildings that are taking place. Now, you would like to write a topic on it. Let's just, or to write a research on it. The first thing is to identify a broad topic. As we go here, broad topic would be lean implementation. I think there's a video on the channel about JIT, just in time and lean. I encourage you to read about that to understand what is lean. But when you're talking about lean, we are mostly talking about manufacturing while minimizing waste. And we explained that waste was anything that wasn't adding value on the customer's perspective in production. So now the topic here is like, we want to see how lean can be implemented in construction. That is the topic. But what is the problem? The problem is we are having many projects that are being delayed and we are having a cost overrun. That is a problem. But the topic is lean. Now, the problem is like, we would like to see how lean being implemented in the construction sector can help somehow to improve the delays or minimize the delays and even reduce the cost overrun. So the problems, how are you going to put it? Although the lean principles are promoted in construction, their measurable impact and project completion time in South African firms remain underexplored. And this is how you formulate the statement. So it is not just something that you just put like that, but also, by the way, when you look at this, it's just for the sake of this video. But in research, one thing that matters, we're going to tackle it in some of our later episodes, is like that every statement you make needs to be backed up by a source to confirm what you're saying. For example, when we say, although lean principles are promoted in construction, according to who? I need to put a source. I need to put sources that are claiming that indeed lean principles are promoted in construction. The other statements say the measurable impact on project completion time in South Africa remains underexplored. That's the strong statement that I'm making, to say yes, it's being explored, but not how it's supposed to. I need to put as well evidences where I can say, for example, in the last 5 years, only maybe 10 researches have been made in South Africa about lean in construction, compared to some other countries in Europe whereby they've written maybe 15, 20, or even many more. Then I can say it is being underexplored. But the idea here is we are moving from the topic to the practical problem to how you formulate the research problem. Another example would be the call center. In this case, we are talking about service quality. Many times you find yourself calling maybe Home Affairs or this particular company for a certain question. You stand in a queue for 10 minutes. The moment, and at that time, your airtime is being depleted. And by the time actually they pick up, you only speak with them for 5 minutes. Then they tell you left with a minute. Then you tell them, can you please call me back? I don't have airtime. And while you are giving them the number, the line cuts, and then you're upset. You have to call them again and start from scratch. In this case, now we are talking about service quality. That is the topic. But the practical problem is like we have high customer complaint. Now, the problem is how are we formulating it? You try to bring in a statement to say there's insufficient empirical evidences on how workforce training influences service quality performance metrics in South African contact centers. But even then, this research problem is good, but it is also vague. As I say, this is only for illustration purpose. Because when you say in South African contact centers, which one exactly, for which type of companies and everything like that? Food and beverages, public services, hospitals, all of those kinds. So you should avoid statements that are broad because if I say South African contact centers, I will have to look at companies all over South Africa. Maybe I'll have to take a sample, but is it going to be representative of South Africa? But the key point here is you see how we are moving from the topic, which is broad, to a practical problem, which is slightly narrow, to the specific in this case, which is the South African contact centers. We're not talking about any contact centers here. But again, even as I say, we can be specific by talking about the public services just as an example. The next step here is like, as we move on, we are asking the research gap. I want you guys to look at the small icon that is there to say that we have many bars, but there's one that is missing in the middle. And research exists because there's already some literature, some other researches that were made in the past. But the research gap, in a simple term, what is it? A research gap is a missing pattern or a missing contribution into a field or into, I'll just put it into a field where not enough information is provided. For example, let's talk about the implementation of AI into the health sector. This is just an example. You might notice that there are some studies like that, but most of those studies have been conducted maybe into the major cities in South Africa, Johannesburg, Cape Town, Durban. But there are few studies that have been made maybe in rural areas and everything. That can be a research gap, whereby we have sources, we have researches that have been done in the same field but in different locations. But there's some locations that are missing, and that becomes a research gap. And a research gap, as it says, it exists when existing studies are outdated. This is to say, for example, many studies were written up until maybe 2015, and from 2015 to 2025, there's nothing that has been written in that field. There's a problem there. Why is it not being written? What can we do? That's how you identify a research gap. Secondly, you have seen studies that were done in different countries. This is the example I gave about South Africa, but in terms of cities. There are some countries that have actually done a lot of research on some topics, while some others have not really been having most of those. Then there can be a research gap when you look, for example, about some topics about AI, for example, or cloning or anything like that. Some of those have been done in some countries that are digitally developed, compared to maybe other countries in Africa, and it brings a gap there where you like, why is it not in Africa? Why is it not done in Africa? How can we do? And that comes a research gap. Sometimes the result are inconsistent, sorry, where you see, for example, there are 10 people who have written on something, maybe 20% are agreeing on something, 40 on the other. So there's no really enough consistency. So what you lack, this is a way for me to look at it as well, so that I can try to see and add on what is already there. Or maybe there's a new context that is emerged. I think you remember when we were talking about COVID-19, I remember during that time it was kind of a new context, but it was also the COVID-19 outbreak. I saw many people start writing the impact of COVID-19 in education, the impact of COVID-19 in the construction sector, and everything. It was a new concept that came. People now need to research about that, to add, to contribute, and everything like that. And we also have technological change. I think one of my key area of focus at this point, I've been mostly looking at the impact of Industry 4.0, but mostly in the education sector. And at this point, we are looking at Industry 4.0. But there are some other countries that are already talking about Industry 5.0. But it's something that we are not really tackling in Africa. And it becomes like there's a change of technology and it brings an insight over something else can be tackled now. That's what we call a research gap. And especially when you are doing your PhD, it is very important because in your PhD, we are looking at novelty. At the master's level, we're trying to understand your ability of doing research to assess it. But at the PhD, we know that you can do research, but we want you to contribute. But you can only contribute if you know what is there and what is not there. And what is not there, that's the research gap. So research must engage with existing knowledge. That's why most of the time when we ask students to do a research gap, we ask them to do a table where you're going to list maybe 20, 25 studies. You highlight them, you show us a pattern that these are the studies that have been conducted here by these authors. But we have noticed that there's a gap of maybe there are the latest study was conducted in 2015. Now it's been 10 years. That's why this study shows itself to be important because at this level, after 10 years, many things have changed. Some economies have changed, some technologies have changed. How does this still impact whatever we are going through? Or we've just noticed that many of the studies have been done in Africa, but few studies like this have been conducted maybe in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe, how can we actually do that and also improve? This is how you build actually a research gap. It must be built on existing knowledge. Now, how do you formulate a problem simply? I've had this issue where we ask a student, simply tell us what is your problem. And with that, we get many students that struggle. This is a small formula I'm giving you. It is not necessary that you have to take it copy and paste, but it gives you an idea. And when we are talking about the formulation, it's the formulation of a research problem. When you reach to that stage, I'm going to show you some examples where you reach that stage. You make a statement such as many organizations in a particular industry, in a concept. In this case, let's say, for example, the health industry. So many organizations in the health industry experience, you push now a specific operational problem. Experience maybe, let's say, we can even talk about many organizations in public hospitals, for example, experience a high number of customers waiting time and dissatisfaction. Yet limited research has actually examined the relationship between the staff performance and the queues management or customers waiting time and everything. So when you make a statement like this, it is giving you first the context, which is the industry. It is highlighting what the operational problem is. And we are looking now at the impact of the research in terms of the relationship where you are. Again, as I said, remember that at this point here, it's always very critical to add sources. Don't just say many industries on which basis. Is it maybe just your company somewhere there and you want to generalize? But remember, this is just a general context, a general formula that I'm bringing, but I'm not saying it has to be like this. But you will notice that many studies, they tend to follow something like this. But keep in mind, sources are very important. That's why you need to do a lot of literature review before you start actually designing a research problem, because you might find out what you want to study, someone else has already studied it. Now, why is identifying the right problem critical? I'm taking you to the last part. A strong problem equal to a strong research. So if whatever you are searching is not strong, then there's no problem even. If there's no problem, there's no research. So if the problem is weak, your objectives become unclear because you don't know what you want to do. One might say, okay, my problem is to try to identify why customers are not happy in South African organization. That's a problem, but it's solving. Which South African organization, which industry, which type of customers, internal or external. It becomes a problem because if you don't have a clear problem, it will be easy for you just to shoot anywhere without necessarily trying to reach your target. Your methodology becomes as well confused, trying to understand customer dissatisfaction in South African companies. Okay, which companies? How am I going to collect my data? Who is going to be my target? Am I going to have people that are underage? Am I going to have people that are maybe retired? The methodology becomes a problem. Am I going to do interviews, observation, send surveys? It becomes an issue. The result becomes as well descriptive because here you're just going to talk in general, where you like many people say this and that, but who are those people? And most of the time, the dissertation becomes as well rejected because your problem it is vague. So that's why your problem needs to be concise. You move from the topic to the problem to the research problem. So thank you very much for watching this video. I really like to encourage you guys to subscribe, like, and even share this content because it allows this video to be referenced by other people and increase the number of views. But that is the best way of supporting us as well. I really hope that you've been able to learn a lot from the second video. We are going to upload others probably in the next weeks to come. But thank you very much for your time, and I'll see you